The truth is, most people misunderstand this. They believe that eloquence is a divine gift, bestowed upon a lucky few at birth, leaving the rest to stumble through the dark, agonizing corridors of social interaction. They view the masters of conversation as manipulators, possessing a magical, perhaps sinister, ability to bend the will of others through mere syllables. But the reality, buried beneath layers of insecurity and social conditioning, is far more profoundly democratic and immensely more demanding. The universe of human connection does not reward the silent, no matter how brilliant their internal world might be. The world, with all its riches, opportunities, and affections, surrenders entirely to those who have mastered the delicate, terrifying, and deeply psychological art of speaking well. This is the chronicle of that awakening. A journey from the suffocating prison of the unsaid word to the liberating pinnacle of masterful communication, where every sentence is a key that unlocks a new realm of human potential. Let us trace the footsteps of the archetypal silent sufferer, a figure who embodies the agonizing paralysis of social anxiety. This individual stands at the edge of a bustling room, their mind a frantic, overflowing reservoir of profound thoughts, sharp observations, and desperate desires to connect. Yet, an invisible, crushing weight presses against their throat. They watch, consumed by a silent, burning tragedy, as lesser minds, armed with nothing but a smooth cadence and a fearless tongue, claim the promotions, attract the romantic partners, and command the respect of the room. The silent sufferer is trapped in a self-constructed purgatory, believing the deeply flawed narrative that silence is golden. They convince themselves that their work will speak for itself, that their intrinsic value will miraculously radiate outward and be recognized by a purely objective world. But the harsh, unforgiving arena of life does not operate on silent meritocracy. It operates on perception, and perception is entirely dictated by the invisible architecture of language. The agonizing realization finally strikes like a physical blow. The world cannot value what it cannot hear. The tragedy is not a lack of capability, but a fatal inability to package that capability into the digestible, compelling currency of spoken words. The transformation begins not with a grand, sweeping speech, but in the terrifying, intimate crucible of self-confrontation. The individual must first violently dismantle the psychological barricades of fear, the paralyzing terror of judgment, the dread of stuttering, the horrifying anticipation of saying the wrong thing. The narrative follows this painful, meticulous process of forging courage. It starts in the quiet isolation of an empty room, standing before a mirror, where the individual forces their trembling vocal cords to articulate thoughts into the empty air. They begin to understand that eloquence is not a spontaneous eruption of genius, but a highly mechanical, deeply rehearsed skill, akin to building a muscle through repetitive, excruciating exertion. They dissect the anatomy of a conversation, realizing that the fear of speaking is fundamentally rooted in a selfish obsession with one's own ego. The anxious mind is entirely consumed by the question, "What will they think of me?" The master communicator, however, violently shifts this paradigm. They project their psychological energy entirely outward, focusing with laser-like intensity on the other person. This shift is the first, miraculous key to the kingdom. When the focus moves from self-preservation to genuine curiosity about the external world, the paralyzing grip of anxiety begins to loosen, replaced by the empowering, dynamic force of active engagement. As the individual ventures out from their sanctuary of silence, they encounter the initial, brutal battlegrounds of everyday interaction. The narrative observes them attempting the most basic, yet profoundly difficult, maneuver, the initiation of dialogue. They learn the terrifying vulnerability of being the first to break the silence. They study the subtle, silent symphony of body language, the orientation of the shoulders, the depth of eye contact, the precise, welcoming curvature of a genuine smile. These nonverbal cues are the silent heralds that prepare the psychological ground for the spoken word. The first attempts are clumsy, fraught with awkward pauses and miscalculated tones. They stumble over greetings, their voices betraying the residual tremors of their long-held fears. But within this awkwardness lies the vital, transformative lesson of resilience. The analysis of this stage reveals a profound truth. The sting of a slightly awkward conversation is infinitely less damaging than the heavy, suffocating regret of a conversation never initiated. Every stumble is a crucial piece of data, a necessary friction that sands down the rough edges of their communicative presence. They learn that the universe does not punish the imperfect speaker, it only punishes the mute. The willingness to be foolish, to dare the awkward silence, is the absolute prerequisite for conversational mastery. The journey deepens as the individual begins to grasp the immense, almost magical power of the first impression. They discover that the opening seconds of any interaction are not merely a polite formality, but a high-stakes psychological negotiation that dictates the entire trajectory of the relationship. The narrative illustrates this through a critical, high-pressure networking event. The protagonist, once the invisible shadow in the corner, now approaches a towering, intimidating figure of authority. Instead of offering a generic, forgettable greeting, they deploy a meticulously crafted opening. They do not speak of the weather or the mundane surroundings. Instead, they offer a highly specific, deeply researched observation about the authority figure's recent work, delivering it with a calm, measured cadence. The effect is instantaneous and visually striking. The towering figure, accustomed to the dull drone of sycophants, suddenly halts. Their defensive posture dissolves, their eyes widen with genuine interest, and the invisible drawbridge to their heavily guarded attention is lowered. The protagonist has not just opened a conversation, they have successfully picked the psychological lock of human interest. Analyzing this triumph exposes the intricate mechanics of capturing attention. The lesson is that people are constantly besieged by a barrage of meaningless noise. To penetrate this dense fog of apathy, one's words must be sharp, highly relevant, and infused with an undeniable sense of purpose. The master of speech understands that the most intoxicating sound to any human ear is not just their own name, but the sound of someone articulating their unspoken values and recognizing their unique contributions. By investing the effort to tailor the opening remarks to the specific psychological landscape of the listener, the speaker demonstrates a profound, almost intoxicating level of respect. This act of tailored communication instantly elevates the speaker from a random, easily dismissed stranger to an individual of high value and acute perception. It proves that the right words, delivered at the precise moment, hold the explosive power to collapse the vast, icy distance between two human beings in a matter of seconds. Having secured the beachhead of attention, the narrative plunges into the delicate, highly dangerous art of the compliment. For the uninitiated, praise is a blunt instrument, often wielding the clunky, transparent stench of manipulation and flattery. The protagonist initially attempts to win favor through broad, sweeping declarations of admiration, only to find their words met with polite, icy skepticism. The world is profoundly cynical, and generic praise is instantly categorized as a deceitful attempt to extract a favor. The turning point occurs when the individual learns the surgical precision of the specific compliment. The narrative paints a scene where the protagonist interacts with a deeply exhausted, unappreciated subordinate. Instead of offering a hollow, "good job," they stop, look the subordinate directly in the eye, and praise a very specific, minute detail of their recent effort, a detail so obscure that only a truly attentive observer would have noticed it. They articulate exactly how that small effort positively impacted the larger whole. The reaction is profound. The subordinate's posture straightens. A genuine, radiant warmth floods their expression, and a fierce, unbreakable bond of loyalty is forged in that single, fleeting moment. The analysis of this interaction reveals the deep, aching hunger that defines the human condition. Beneath the professional armor and the stoic facades, every individual is desperately starving for sincere, highly specific validation. The lesson is that true praise is not an act of submission, but an act of profound, empathetic observation. When you praise a specific detail, you are not just validating the work, you are validating the person's existence. You are silently declaring, "I see you, I see your effort, and it matters." This is the alchemy of human connection. The master of communication understands that words are not merely vehicles for information, they are emotional payloads. When deployed with absolute sincerity and surgical precision, A compliment ceases to be a mere social pleasantry and transforms into a powerful psychological anchor, binding the listener to the speaker with chains of gratitude and mutual respect. The protagonist has begun to realize that the ability to speak well is indistinguishable from the ability to love and appreciate humanity in all its flawed, striving glory. As the protagonist's confidence surges, they encounter the treacherous, highly explosive minefield of workplace politics and professional communication. Here, the stakes are magnified, and a single, ill-conceived sentence can detonate a career. The narrative follows them into a high-pressure boardroom, a hostile environment dominated by aggressive, dominant personalities violently clashing over resources and ideologies. The old, silent self would have shrunk into the background, allowing the loudest voices to dictate the future. But the transformed individual now understands that the boardroom is a theater of power, and language is the primary weapon. They observe a heated, escalating conflict between two senior executives, a collision of massive, fragile egos that threatens to derail a crucial project. Instead of adding to the chaotic noise or remaining entirely mute, the protagonist executes a masterful intervention. They do not aggressively take a side, nor do they offer a weak, pacifying compromise. They wait for the precise, microscopic lull in the shouting, and then they speak with a tone of absolute, chilling calmness. They perfectly summarize the core, underlying anxieties of both warring factions, validating their emotional realities without necessarily agreeing with their conclusions. They reframe the hostile confrontation not as a battle between enemies, but as a shared struggle against a common, external problem. The profound lesson extracted from this boardroom triumph is the staggering power of emotional regulation and strategic reframing. In the heat of conflict, the vast majority of people become slaves to their limbic systems, their speech degenerating into reactive, defensive attacks. The master communicator, however, maintains an impenetrable fortress of psychological detachment. They understand that to control the room, one must completely control one's own internal state, by refusing to match the aggressive, chaotic energy of the conflict, and by deploying language that clarifies and unifies rather than divides. The speaker instantly assumes the mantle of absolute leadership. They become the gravitational center of the room. The analysis dictates that true eloquence in the face of hostility is not about having the sharpest comeback, it is about possessing the profound, empathetic capacity to absorb the toxic energy of the room and transubstantiate it into a constructive, forward-moving narrative. The individual has proven that skillful speech is the ultimate tool for navigating the dangerous, jagged cliffs of human ambition and ego, transforming potential disasters into monuments of collaborative triumph. The ascension of the protagonist naturally brings a sudden, overwhelming influx of demands upon their time and energy. With increased visibility comes the relentless siege of requests, favors, and unsolicited burdens. The narrative shifts to examine the agonizing, deeply uncomfortable necessity of the refusal. The amateur speaker views the word no as an act of violence, a guaranteed trigger for anger and the severing of relationships. Consequently, they fall into the tragic, exhausting trap of the people pleaser, saying yes to everything until their own life force is entirely depleted. The protagonist faces this exact crucible when approached by a powerful, highly influential colleague demanding a massive, unreasonable commitment of time for a low-value project. The internal terror is immense, the instinct to submit is powerful. But the individual realizes that their newfound communicative power is useless if it cannot be used to aggressively defend their own boundaries. They must learn the elegant, highly strategic art of the graceful refusal. The interaction unfolds with the tension of a high-wire act. The protagonist does not offer a blunt, offensive rejection, nor do they invent a weak, easily dismantled lie. They employ the sophisticated technique of the empathetic deflection. They begin by enthusiastically validating the importance of the colleague's project, making the requester feel entirely respected and heard. Then, they seamlessly transition into a clear, completely unapologetic statement of their own current, overwhelming priorities, framing the refusal not as a lack of desire to help, but as a tragic, unavoidable conflict of intense commitments. Finally, they offer a highly specific, alternative solution, a different resource, a partial contribution, or a connection to another individual, thereby softening the blow of the rejection and leaving the relationship completely intact. The colleague, though initially disappointed, walks away feeling respected rather than rejected, entirely accepting the boundary that was so masterfully drawn. Analyzing this delicate operation exposes the ultimate maturity of the master communicator. The lesson is that the ability to say no with grace is the absolute bedrock of self-respect and the ultimate protector of one's personal value. When a refusal is communicated with profound empathy and absolute clarity, it does not destroy respect, it exponentially increases it. The world naturally, instinctively preys upon the weak, compliant boundaries of the people-pleaser. But it fiercely respects the individual who values their own time enough to violently defend it. The master understands that a highly strategic, beautifully articulated no is infinitely more powerful and beneficial than a resentful, half-hearted yes. By mastering the art of the graceful refusal, the protagonist has not only protected their precious energy but has also elevated their perceived status in the ruthless hierarchy of human interaction. They have learned that true eloquence is not just about knowing exactly what to say, but knowing exactly when and how to fiercely, unapologetically withhold compliance. The inevitable progression of the master communicator leads directly into the darkest, most terrifying psychological abyss of professional existence, the catastrophic, undeniable failure. The narrative watches the protagonist, flush with recent victories, suddenly plunge into a nightmare of their own making. A massive, high-stakes project collapses due to a glaring, inexcusable oversight on their part. The amateur, driven by the frantic, terrified screams of their fragile ego, would immediately engage in a frantic campaign of deflection, fabricating elaborate excuses, blaming incompetent subordinates, or pointing a trembling finger at the unpredictable fluctuations of the market. They would view an apology as a total, humiliating surrender, a public execution of their professional worth. But the transformed individual, deeply steeped in the advanced alchemy of human interaction, approaches the impending disaster with a radically different, almost alien psychology. They do not flee from the raging fire, they walk deliberately, calmly into the very center of the inferno. As they enter the suffocating, tense atmosphere of the executive office, facing the furious, red-faced authority figure whose trust they have severely violated, they do not offer a single, pathetic syllable of justification. Instead, they execute the terrifying, masterful maneuver of the absolute, unmitigated apology. They look directly into the eyes of the furious superior and loudly, clearly, and completely claim every single ounce of the crushing blame. They meticulously articulate exactly what went wrong, demonstrating a flawless understanding of the disastrous impact their mistake has caused, and present a fully formed, aggressive strategy for immediate restitution. The profound analysis of this seemingly suicidal tactic reveals the ultimate, counterintuitive genius of the master communicator. The lesson extracted from the ashes of this failure is that a rapid, total, and unapologetic admission of guilt completely neutralizes the opponent's righteous anger. When an individual fiercely and publicly attacks themselves, they instantly steal the executioner's axe. The furious superior, totally deprived of the expected, defensive resistance, is left with a sudden, overwhelming psychological vacuum. Their massive, surging adrenaline has nothing to crash against. Consequently, the superior's mind is forcefully shifted from the aggressive posture of assigning blame to the cooperative posture of solving the problem. The master knows that the human ego respects strength above all else. And there is no greater demonstration of terrifying, unshakable internal strength than the willingness to stand completely naked and vulnerable before the consequences of one's own actions. By embracing the absolute worst of the situation, the protagonist not only survives the catastrophic error but miraculously emerges with their reputation for integrity and immense psychological resilience exponentially enhanced. They have proven that true eloquence is not merely the ability to celebrate victories, but the incredible, rare capacity to narrate one's own defeats with such staggering dignity that the world is forced to admire the ruins. With the armor of extreme accountability firmly forged, the narrative propels the protagonist into the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled arena of complex negotiation. Here, words are no longer mere instruments of connection, they are heavy, lethal weapons of persuasion, deployed to secure massive resources and dictate the future of entire enterprises. The scene unfolds across a sprawling, polished mahogany table, where the protagonist faces a consortium of deeply cynical, hardened industry veterans. These opponents are masters of the poker face, employing suffocating, heavy silences and aggressive, intimidating posturing to crush the will of lesser negotiators. The amateur would nervously fill the terrifying silence with a frantic, desperate verbal barrage, rapidly compromising their own position, eagerly offering premature concessions just to relieve the agonizing social tension. But the protagonist, now a seasoned architect of human psychology, sits perfectly still. They match the heavy silence with an impenetrable, serene stillness of their own. When they finally speak, their words are not a desperate pitch of features and benefits, but a series of highly calibrated, deeply probing questions designed to surgically excavate the hidden, unarticulated fears of the opposing side. They recognize that the veterans are not truly negotiating over profit margins or delivery schedules, they are agonizing over deeply buried anxieties regarding their own legacy, their market dominance, and their personal security. The staggering lesson revealed in this intense corporate crucible is the realization that the most vital, explosive moments of communication occur completely beneath the surface of the spoken word. The analysis dictates that successful negotiation is never a logical debate, it is a profound, empathetic hostage rescue mission. The master communicator understands that human beings make decisions based entirely on deep, primal emotions, and then desperately construct logical frameworks to justify those emotional surrenders to the rest of the world. By skillfully shifting the dialogue away from the cold, hard numbers and focusing entirely on alleviating the secret, burning anxieties of the opponents, the protagonist completely bypasses their thick, logical defenses. They do not argue, they align. They reframe the negotiation from a hostile, zero-sum battle over limited resources into a collaborative, unified crusade against a shared, external threat. When the opponents unconsciously realize that this individual understands their deepest, unspoken fears better than they do themselves, the heavy, iron gates of resistance miraculously swing open. The protagonist secures a deal of unprecedented magnitude not by out-talking the room, but by becoming the most profound, terrifyingly perceptive listener at the table, proving that the ultimate power in any negotiation belongs exclusively to the person who can accurately name the ghost haunting the other side of the table. As their influence and visibility dramatically expand, the protagonist inevitably attracts the toxic, envious attention of rivals. The narrative plunges into the terrifying, highly public spectacle of the sudden, malicious verbal attack. During a massive, crowded industry conference, a bitter competitor attempts to publicly humiliate the protagonist with a sharp, highly aggressive, and deeply insulting question, designed specifically to shatter their composure and expose them to the ridicule of the watching hundreds. The atmosphere in the massive auditorium instantly crystallizes into a thick, suffocating tension. The crowd holds its collective breath, anticipating a brutal, ugly confrontation or a humiliating, stuttering retreat. The primitive, reactive brain of the amateur would violently explode in defensive anger, launching a counterattack that would only succeed in dragging them down into the mud, fundamentally validating the attacker's premise. Alternatively, they might freeze, their mind going totally blank in the blinding spotlight of public humiliation. But the master communicator deploys the absolute, most devastating, and highly sophisticated weapon in the entire human arsenal, razor-sharp, self-deprecating humor. Without a single micro-expression of anger, they offer a brilliant, incredibly witty response that playfully exaggerates the insult, turning the malicious attack into a shared, uproarious joke at their own expense, before seamlessly pivoting the energy back to the core, serious topic at hand. The profound analysis of this electrifying, high-wire moment reveals the incredible, almost magical power of humor as a tool for absolute social dominance. The lesson is that anger is the ultimate confession of weakness. When a person reacts with rage to an insult, They are silently screaming to the world that the attacker has successfully penetrated their psychological armor and successfully dictated their emotional state. Humor, however, is the undeniable signature of supreme, unshakable confidence. By refusing to take the insult seriously, and by effortlessly transmuting the toxic, hostile energy of the attacker into a source of entertainment for the crowd, the master communicator completely castrates the rival. The attacker is left looking incredibly small, bitter, and utterly ineffective, while the protagonist's social status instantly skyrockets. They have demonstrated a level of emotional regulation so profound, so entirely detached from the desperate clingings of the fragile ego, that they become practically invincible in the public eye. The crowd does not just respect them, they are completely mesmerized by the sheer, effortless grace under fire, proving that the person who controls the laughter fundamentally controls the entire hierarchy of the room. Yet, the ultimate, most agonizing, and universally tragic failure of human communication does not occur in the ruthless boardrooms or on the glaring, highly public stages of the world. It happens in the quiet, intimate, and supposedly safe confines of the domestic sphere. The narrative shifts its intense, piercing gaze to the tragic irony of the highly successful professional who commands armies with their eloquence by day, only to completely destroy their own family with careless, brutal, and profoundly negligent words by night. The protagonist, despite their massive external success, finds their romantic relationship rapidly deteriorating into a cold, silent wasteland of bitter resentments and endless, exhausting arguments. They fall into the incredibly common, deeply fatal trap of treating their partner not as a cherished ally, but as a subordinate to be managed or an opponent to be defeated in a debate. When their partner expresses a deep, vulnerable frustration, the protagonist's instinct, honed in the corporate battlefield, is to immediately offer a cold, logical solution, or worse, to aggressively invalidate the emotion with rapid-fire, intellectual counter-arguments. They win the petty argument, but they systematically, relentlessly slaughter the intimacy. The deeply emotional analysis of this personal crucible forces the protagonist to unlearn everything that made them powerful in the brutal external world. The lesson extracted from the crumbling ruins of love is that emotional intimacy is governed by a completely inverted set of communicative laws. In the ruthless marketplace, words are used to aggressively assert dominance and solve complex, objective problems, but in the fragile, incredibly sensitive ecosystem of love, words must be used exclusively to build a sanctuary of absolute, unconditional safety. The master communicator realizes, with a heavy, crushing sense of guilt, that their partner does not want a brilliant, highly logical consultant. They desperately, agonizingly want a witness to their pain. The transformation requires the absolute subjugation of the problem-solving ego. The protagonist learns the agonizingly difficult art of pure, empathetic validation. They learn to sit in the heavy, uncomfortable presence of their partner's negative emotions without rushing to fix them, without getting defensive, and without offering a single, solitary word of advice. They learn to simply say, with profound, undeniable sincerity, "I hear you, and your feelings make complete sense." This radical, incredibly profound shift in domestic communication yields a miraculous, breathtaking resurrection of the relationship. By completely abandoning the toxic need to be factually right, the protagonist successfully creates an environment where their partner feels entirely, unconditionally seen and deeply understood. The thick, ancient walls of defensiveness slowly crumble, replaced by a rushing, vibrant river of renewed passion and unbreakable trust. The individual discovers that the most powerful, life-altering words ever spoken are not the brilliant, soaring declarations made to a crowd of thousands, but the quiet, incredibly vulnerable whispers of complete understanding shared in the dark. They prove that true mastery of communication is not a rigid, aggressive weapon to be wielded blindly in all directions, but a highly fluid, deeply sensitive instrument that must be precisely, carefully tuned to the specific, unique frequency of every individual soul it encounters. The journey from silence to eloquence is ultimately a journey from deep, blinding selfishness to profound, absolute empathy, a transformation that touches every single, microscopic facet of human existence. The profound, Intimate metamorphosis achieved within the quiet, sacred sanctuary of domestic life serves as the ultimate, indispensable catalyst for the protagonist's final, most spectacular ascension in the broader, infinitely more complex theater of human civilization, armed with the devastatingly powerful, newly forged weapon of absolute, unconditional empathy. The master communicator steps out of the private sphere and directly into the most volatile, terrifying, and deeply hostile environments the modern world can possibly construct. The narrative violently thrusts the individual into the terrifying epicenter of a massive, incredibly hostile public crisis, a situation where the collective, furious anger of a wronged, desperately fearful community threatens to entirely incinerate a vital, sprawling enterprise. Hundreds of deeply aggrieved, highly suspicious individuals have gathered in a suffocating, overheated auditorium, their collective emotional state a highly combustible powder keg of raw, unadulterated fury, deep-seated resentment, and absolute, unyielding distrust. The air in the massive room vibrates with a thick, physical tension, heavy with the terrifying promise of imminent, explosive chaos. The amateur, terrified and hopelessly outmatched by the sheer, crushing magnitude of the collective rage, would foolishly attempt to ascend the stage armed with cold, sterile logic, presenting meticulously constructed pie charts, rigid statistical analyses, and dry, highly defensive corporate jargon. They would desperately attempt to rationally explain away the deep, burning pain of the crowd, inadvertently pouring highly explosive gasoline directly onto the raging, out-of-control inferno of their collective anger by completely invalidating their shared, lived emotional reality. But the protagonist, now possessing an almost supernatural, deeply penetrating mastery over the hidden, invisible currents of human psychology, completely discards the sterile, useless shield of facts and figures. They understand, with chilling, absolute clarity, that when an angry mob is screaming in the agonizing language of pure, primal emotion, answering them in the cold, detached language of absolute logic is a catastrophic, completely fatal psychological error. The master communicator slowly, deliberately ascends the heavy, wooden steps of the massive stage, completely unarmed, physically unprotected, and entirely vulnerable before the roaring, hostile sea of furious faces. They do not immediately rush to speak, deliberately employing the heavy, terrifying, and incredibly powerful instrument of absolute silence. They stand perfectly still, absorbing the violent, crashing waves of the crowd's toxic hatred without flinching, without a single, microscopic gesture of defensiveness, and without breaking their calm, deeply empathetic, and entirely unwavering gaze. This agonizingly prolonged, incredibly deliberate silence acts as a massive, invisible psychological vacuum, slowly, inexorably draining the frantic, explosive energy from the sprawling room. When the heavy, suffocating shouting finally, inevitably fractures into a confused, highly tense murmur, the protagonist utters their incredibly calculated, profoundly impactful first words. They do not launch into a defensive, highly rehearsed corporate apology, nor do they aggressively demand order and respect from the hostile crowd. Instead, they unleash the absolute, most universally irresistible, and profoundly disarming psychological weapon in the entire history of human civilization, the perfectly crafted, deeply resonant, and intensely personal narrative story. The protagonist speaks with a quiet, incredibly powerful, and deeply vibrating resonance, slowly weaving a highly vivid, intensely emotional story that perfectly, flawlessly mirrors the exact, agonizing pain, the deep, terrifying anxieties, and the profound, crushing betrayals that the angry crowd has intimately experienced. They do not arrogantly tell the furious audience how they should logically feel, they vividly, beautifully, and heartbreakingly paint a completely undeniable, emotionally devastating picture of exactly how they already feel, validating their furious anger with such astonishing, breathtaking accuracy that the crowd is entirely, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming, unexpected shock of being profoundly, deeply understood. The incredibly deep, highly complex analysis of this masterful, awe-inspiring public performance exposes the incredible, almost magical neurological supremacy of the narrative story over cold, hard logic. The The profound, undeniable lesson extracted from this massive, public crucible is that the human brain is fundamentally, entirely, and completely hardwired for storytelling. When an individual is aggressively presented with dry facts or hostile, contrary arguments, the highly defensive, logical centers of their brain instantly illuminate, rapidly constructing thick, impenetrable walls of skepticism, counter-arguments, and fierce, unyielding resistance. However, when an individual is completely immersed in a highly compelling, emotionally resonant story, their heavy, defensive neurological walls miraculously, completely collapse. They stop aggressively fighting the speaker and instantly, unconsciously begin to deeply, profoundly identify with the narrative, vividly projecting their own hidden pain, secret desires, and burning fears directly onto the canvas of the speaker's perfectly chosen words. The master communicator intimately, profoundly understands that a perfectly timed, deeply empathetic story is a psychological Trojan horse, effortlessly, completely bypassing the heavy, iron gates of human suspicion and delivering a massive, incredibly powerful payload of profound persuasion directly into the vulnerable, highly receptive emotional core of the audience. As the protagonist's narrative gracefully reaches its emotional zenith, the previously hostile, furiously screaming crowd has been entirely, miraculously transformed. The toxic, burning hatred has been completely washed away, replaced by a deep, powerful, and intensely unified silence of absolute, unquestioning connection. The protagonist has successfully, flawlessly orchestrated the ultimate, most difficult psychological maneuver. They have completely, entirely aligned their own massive, beating heart with the collective, rhythmic pulse of the massive, terrifying crowd, miraculously transforming a violent, explosive mob into a deeply attentive, profoundly cooperative, and highly receptive congregation. This staggering, completely unparalleled victory completely catapults the protagonist into the absolute, rarefied stratosphere of human influence, where they are constantly, relentlessly called upon to navigate the most incredibly delicate, highly sensitive, and deeply consequential interactions between towering, massive egos and deeply entrenched, incredibly stubborn global powers. The sweeping, intense narrative follows them into the incredibly opulent, highly exclusive, and deeply guarded chambers of the global elite, where the incredibly wealthy and the massively powerful engage in silent, highly destructive wars of absolute dominance. Here, the protagonist entirely abandons the dramatic, highly visible theatrics of the public stage, seamlessly adopting the incredibly subtle, deeply invisible, and perfectly calibrated methods of the ultimate, absolute psychological chameleon. They encounter incredibly powerful, deeply arrogant individuals who are completely, entirely accustomed to absolute, unquestioning obedience and fawning, sickeningly sweet sycophancy. The amateur, completely blinded by the blinding, terrifying aura of massive wealth and unyielding power, would instantly, pathetically crumble into a trembling, agreeable mess of weak, submissive compliance, completely, entirely losing any shred of individual respect or negotiating leverage. The master communicator, however, plays a highly dangerous, incredibly thrilling, and exquisitely complex psychological game of subtle, calibrated resistance and profound, strategic validation. They recognize, with piercing, unclouded psychological clarity, that the incredibly powerful, highly arrogant individual is actually, secretly starving for an authentic, intellectual equal who possesses the terrifying, massive internal courage to gently, intellectually challenge them without ever, for a single moment, triggering their massive, highly fragile, and deeply insecure ego. The profound, intricate analysis of this incredibly high-level, deeply psychological dance reveals the absolute, ultimate sophistication of human interaction. The lesson is that true, massive eloquence is not always about speaking beautifully, it is frequently about knowing exactly, precisely how to disagree beautifully. The master communicator entirely masters the incredibly rare, highly dangerous art of the constructive pivot. When confronted with a terrible, highly destructive idea from an incredibly powerful, deeply terrifying superior, they never, absolutely never use the highly toxic, instantly alienating word, but, which acts as a massive, destructive wrecking ball to the other person's pride. Instead, they seamlessly, brilliantly employ the connective, highly expansive word, and gently, enthusiastically validating the tiny, microscopic grain of truth completely hidden within the terrible idea, and then smoothly, effortlessly pivoting the immense, forward momentum of the conversation toward a vastly superior, highly productive solution, framing the new, brilliant idea as a natural, entirely inevitable extension of the powerful superior's original, flawed thought. They completely, selflessly surrender the petty, ego-driven need for public credit, allowing the highly arrogant individual to completely, entirely believe that the brilliant, saving strategy was entirely their own massive, unprompted creation. The master intimately, deeply knows that if you desperately, aggressively fight for the temporary, fleeting spotlight of credit, you will constantly, relentlessly battle fierce, incredibly bitter resistance, but if you completely, selflessly surrender the credit, you can absolutely, undeniably, and effortlessly rule the entire, sprawling world from the deep, invisible, and highly protected shadows. As the epic, sprawling journey reaches its absolute, glorious, and deeply philosophical zenith, the protagonist stands quietly at the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, looking down at the vast, highly complex, and incredibly chaotic tapestry of human connection they have so masterfully, flawlessly woven. They have completely, entirely conquered the terrifying, paralyzing fear of the silent room. They have brilliantly, effortlessly navigated the deadly, highly explosive minefields of corporate ambition and bitter, toxic rivalry. They have miraculously, beautifully resurrected the dying, crumbling ashes of personal, intimate love, and they have successfully, completely tamed the roaring, furious, and terrifying beasts of angry, hostile public mobs. Yet, in this ultimate, quiet moment of supreme, unmatched triumph, they realize a profound, deeply humbling, and entirely inescapable truth that completely shatters all preconceived, cynical notions of highly manipulative, dark communication. The ultimate, most devastatingly powerful secret of the absolute master is not a complex, highly rehearsed linguistic trick, nor is it a dark, highly manipulative psychological tactic designed to blindly, aggressively control the weak, unsuspecting masses. The terrifying, beautiful, and absolute truth is that complete, total, and undeniable eloquence is ultimately, entirely impossible without a foundation of profound, absolute, and completely unshakable sincerity. The deeply philosophical, incredibly profound analysis of this final, ultimate realization brings the entire, massive narrative full circle. The ultimate lesson is that the human subconscious is an incredibly powerful, highly sensitive, and completely infallible lie detector. You can flawlessly, perfectly memorize every single, highly complex conversational technique. You can perfectly, exactly mirror the open, inviting body language of a saint. And you can highly strategically, perfectly deploy every single, brilliantly crafted psychological trigger in existence. But if your internal, deeply hidden intention is purely selfish, highly manipulative, or deeply deceitful, the microscopic, invisible micro-expressions of your face and the incredibly subtle, highly nuanced frequencies of your voice will completely, undeniably, and violently betray you to the deeply intuitive, highly protective instincts of your listener. The absolute, unparalleled masters of communication, the rare, historical individuals who have successfully, completely moved massive mountains, peacefully stopped terrifying, bloody wars, and successfully, permanently united deeply fractured, highly hostile nations, were not just incredibly smooth, highly practiced talkers, they were profoundly, deeply, and intensely sincere believers. They cultivated a deep, massive, and entirely genuine love for the incredibly flawed, highly complex, and deeply tragic human condition. The protagonist finally, completely understands that, speaking skillfully, is not about carefully, deceitfully putting on a highly polished, incredibly fake mask to blindly fool the ignorant world. It is about completely, entirely stripping away the heavy, terrifying, and deeply protective masks of one's own fearful ego, allowing the pure, unadulterated, and highly resonant truth of one's authentic, deeply vulnerable soul to directly, clearly, and completely speak to the hidden, terrified, and deeply isolated soul of another human being. They realize that every single spoken word is a massive, incredibly powerful transfer of actual, living energy, and the ultimate, most profound responsibility of the speaker is to ensure that this massive energy is utilized exclusively to heal, to build, to profoundly connect, and to beautifully elevate, rather than to violently destroy, to aggressively manipulate, or to coldly, selfishly divide. The core message and profound, transformative meaning that this monumental book intends to definitively, absolutely convey to its readers is that the ability to communicate with exceptional, undeniable grace, profound, strategic empathy, and highly intelligent tact is the single, most critical, and absolutely indispensable survival skill in the entire, incredibly complex modern human ecosystem. It teaches, with absolute, unyielding clarity, that your destiny, your massive financial success, the deep, profound quality of your intimate relationships, and the ultimate, lasting magnitude of your earthly legacy are entirely, strictly, and absolutely dictated by the precise, exact quality of the words that exit your mouth. It forcefully dismantles the incredibly toxic, highly defeatist myth that individuals are permanently, genetically trapped by their inherent, deeply ingrained social awkwardness, proving instead that brilliant, world-altering eloquence is a highly learnable, deeply systematic, and incredibly rewarding discipline. The book demands that the reader completely, entirely stop viewing communication as a highly stressful, deeply terrifying burden or a dark, manipulative chore, and instead embrace it as the highest, most beautiful, and profoundly powerful art form in existence, an art form where the primary, essential medium is not cold, hard paint or rigid, lifeless clay, but the incredibly delicate, highly responsive, and deeply beautiful fabric of the human heart itself. By mastering the incredible, immense power to listen deeply without ego, to speak truth wrapped perfectly in absolute, undeniable empathy, and to completely, selflessly tailor every single, solitary message to the profound, hidden psychological needs of the receiving audience, any individual can miraculously, permanently transform their entire reality, turning closed, heavily guarded doors into wide, welcoming avenues, and transforming cold, deeply suspicious strangers into fierce, highly devoted, and completely lifelong allies. The ultimate conquest of the world does not belong to those with the sharpest swords, but to those possessing the profound, empathetic wisdom to speak the exact words that heal the heart.